Nick, welcome to Giant Ideas.
It's very good to be here.
Thanks for coming. Before we get into the kind of big discussion topics about society and tech and big business, I want to ask you personally about technology and the impact on your life. So I say this as someone whose whole career was built on tech. I did a photo app, which was not possible without the advent of the iPhone and social media. That was my big break. So I benefited from it massively. But if I just look at my own kind of home life, am I happier with a phone that I'm always on and social media? Probably I'd be a better dad, maybe a better husband if I wasn't always on my phone and if I was kind of, had more hobbies that I could just get on with. And so on a personal level, sometimes I do wonder, even as someone who's benefited so much from this and whose day job is to go back technology founders, is it actually good for our happiness? I'm just curious your very personal reflections on that.
I think happiness is a super difficult benchmark. I wouldn't say it's a cut and dry judgment on if that's the basis. I mean, God, happiness, schmappiness. How on earth do you define that? But no. I suspect we're very similar. I mean, I've worked in tech for many years now, but I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm a sort of massive sort of tech sort of geek. Okay. I wouldn't call myself a sort of massive early adopter. Pretty conventional use of AI at the moment. Very intense use, like lots of people, of messaging apps. Spend far too much time reading the news online. Don't actually use social media apps that much. But to your point, and I'm not sure this categorizes as happiness, but there's certainly things that I know bring me happiness that I sort of accidentally forego, and I definitely think spending too much time on the phone is. So reading is a classic example. I've always been a pretty voracious reader, particularly fiction. And I remember in my the sort of crazy years when I was in very, very high pressure environment in politics and government, I would find reading just even a few pages of a novel in the evening was just such a tonic. It was like, and I just too often now find myself looking at my screen instead, and then dozing off, and then not really. So I think the whole, the phone next to the bed, I think is my sort of biting. So okay, I've now resolved, as of this moment, as of this evening, I'm gonna put the phone somewhere else. But definitely, it's the displacement. It's the displacement issue, and I think you need to be disciplined, and of course it's always. You've got kids, yeah. So my kids are now, well, the two are adults, one's a teen, but. It's always difficult to pull me with the kids. Get off your phone, and you don't want to make it a flashpoint because that's negative. And no, it's not straightforward. It's not straightforward at all.
And for your kids, have you found the classic thing of needing to try and drag them away from screens, whether it's phones or computer games?
It's not too bad actually. Partly, I've got 3 boys who just basically football obsessed.
Right.
So okay. I mean. How many times can you watch a Messi goal on YouTube, and is it really harmful if you watch it 100 times rather than 99 times? I don't know. You know what I mean?
Right.
I may be completely deluded, and maybe they're doing all sorts of nefarious things online. But I get the impression they've always had pretty plain vanilla online taste. But do I sort of feel as a dad sometimes? Can you just get off your phone, mate?
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't? Absolutely.
We had Alain de Botton on the show, and he came up with this very pithy one-liner, which was that the secret to a modern marriage is to be more interesting than your partner's smartphone, which I found depressingly true.
But unfortunately, there might be quite a high bar sometimes. Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe if we broaden it out beyond our kind of personal lives, just to the impact of technology on society, I want to talk to you about your book and the fractured internet and AI, but maybe just start with social media. Obviously, you have this huge role at Meta. I sort of, every time I hear you speak and write, I basically find myself agreeing kind of with your point of view. I think we have similar worldviews. But the one area I kind of disagree with is social media. And again, I say that as someone who's built a social media app, sold it to Microsoft. But to me, and I think you have a contrarian view, because I think most people, even in tech, and maybe particularly in tech, would say social media has, had negative impacts on mental health, teenagers, has driven polarization. You, as I understand it, have quite a different view, which is that that's not necessarily causation.
Yeah, and for anyone who really wants to get into this, sorry to sound like a walking publicist for my own book, but I do try and go over this in very considerable detail in the book, and in quite painstaking detail, because no one's going to believe my subjective view. They're going to say, "Oh, you're just a paid shill for a big tech company," and so on. So I do try and marshal the evidence, the academic empirical evidence. And I think even if you are a sort of rabid, sort of anti-big tech, anti-social media person, if you're exposed to the evidence, it is just generally, at its most mild, much, much more mixed than a lot of the kind of, I think, increasingly caricatured assertions about the link between social media consumption and human behavior, or actually evidence confounds it completely. But it slightly depends on what sort of harm you're looking at. I think on kids, for instance, it is self-evidently the case. I think that social media use can be very negative for some kids and so on. It's just much, much harder to prove that is a societal level phenomenon. It's a mass phenomenon, clearly for particular individuals. And there is some evidence, again, empirical evidence, that passive scrolling, particularly not exclusively by teen girls, is not great at all. And so, but on polarization, oddly, there I think the evidence is more unambiguously against the stereotypical assertion. If you look at some of the big studies that have been done in Stanford, they did a huge longitudinal study looking at, I think it was, 9 countries over 40 years, and they measure what's called affective polarization. It's how you sort of view and treat someone who with whom you don't agree, and so on. You really do have to search almost in vain for a causal link. Most effective polarization, which has been measurable in the United States, erupted before social media even became a thing. Effective polarization is often highest amongst segments of the population, the old, those without a college education, as the Americans put it, who don't use social media. And there's also an interesting technical reason why the sources of political polarization, at least, seem to be more associated with technologies like cable news or a highly partisan tabloid newspaper than social media, or rather, I'll be specific here, or rather social media of old. I think social media is mutating very, very fast from a kind of human thing into more of a sort of pipeline of algorithmically recommended, often synthetically generated content. And the reason is this, is for anyone who's listening to this who uses Facebook, you will know that when people say you have friends on Facebook, they're often actually not really friends. They're that annoying person who you worked next to in the office 10 years ago, you kept on with on social media. It's your ex-girlfriend, it's your ex-boyfriend, it's the mum of your daughter's football team. It's what the sociologists call weak, it's your mad uncle. It's weak sociological links. And because who you are friends with is the principal signal by which the ranking algorithm chooses what you see before you see anything else, it follows that actually, in terms of ideological and political content, you're actually seeing what is being prioritized by the system is the political views of your mad uncle or that person you haven't seen in 10 years. It's actually very mixed, much more mixed than if you read the Daily Mail every day or only watch Fox News.
Right.
So the Berkman Klein Institute, for instance, at Harvard University, have done some really interesting work. I think it was around the 2020 election, maybe it was before, and they found this flywheel of Trump on Twitter and cable news being the thing that really, really created these sort of bubble effects. So I don't think on polarization is as, and also the only other thing I would say is I've always been a bit struck by the willingness of people to make what are in effect sort of techno-determinist assertions, which are completely ahistorical. It's as if conflict and hatred and strife were invented by the reshare button. I mean, it's just like patently not true. We've had civil war, world wars, revolutions and conflict, unfortunately, from the dawn of time. And so I always find it so odd when people sort of say, oh, nasty things have happened because I'm spending all my time. No, I'm afraid awful things have happened throughout our whole history. So I found both empirically and through the lens of history, I particularly think the assertions around the effect of social media on kind of animosity, if I can, social, ideological animosity, for me, it's never really stacked up. Doesn't mean a whole bunch of other collateral effects. Absolutely doesn't mean that these companies haven't made some egregious mistakes. Doesn't mean that there aren't very negative things which can happen by people who are using social media, and of course, ghastly content. I don't want to sort of flip the other way.
Sure.
And the reason I feel so strongly about this is as a sort of ex-politician and lawmaker, I mean, you just get very bad policy when it's driven by basically newspaper headlines. You remember, a lot of this debate is driven in part by vested interests in the publishing industry.
As with AI.
Yes, who quite understandably loathe and fear these companies because they've messed up their advertising model and they worry that they're attracting eyeballs and people aren't buying their papers. So you've got a you've got a sort of gatekeeping vested interest that is the prism through which so much of this debate happens. And in the world I previously occupied in politics, that's particularly pronounced because politicians, of course, worked out that the easiest way to get favourable coverage on page 2 or 3 of the Telegraph or the Times or whatever is to just say, I've issued a press release saying I'm going to, clip Silicon Valley's wings. And everyone goes, hooray. And so I guess I just it's not that I don't have any monopoly of wisdom. I just do think on some of these issues we have sort of slightly wallowed in assertion rather than evidence, and on occasion, sort of techno moral panic or moral panic about technology, which again, as I explain in the book, is not new. I mean, you see this repeatedly, whether it's the bicycle, the car, the internet, the phone, the television. I'm almost 59. I remember vividly when I was young, when ads started on terrestrial television. I had kids in the class whose parents would send them out of the room because they thought, the ads for crispy pancakes or something would sort of get into their neural pathways, and they use exactly the same language as they now do about online. My mum wouldn't allow me and my brothers and my sister to watch. I think it was, we used to have endless. We were so annoyed. She had this thing that we were not allowed to watch more than 30 minutes television. Somehow 30 minutes was a sort of...
You'd go crazy after that.
Otherwise, I know something really loopy was going to happen. So
we had the same with computer games. They were sort of seen as really genuinely very bad for your soul.
No, but do you remember in the 80s, like screaming headlines? If you use this computer game, little Jimmy, your otherwise beatifically angelic little son, will become an axe murderer.
Yeah,
I mean,
serial
it's
killer.
absurd.
But no, I'm with you. And I think also on the incumbents, I think is a really big problem, actually. I think I was talking to someone in the UK government fairly high up, and I was saying, why are you not doing more to make the UK very friendly to AI? And they said, look, we'd love to do more, but all of the incumbent media companies who are so afraid of their business models being destroyed by AI are so aggressive against it.
But look what happened. Was it 2 years ago? I mean, I'm not sure if you were there, but I was one of the hordes of people who were in the pouring rain outside Milton Keynes in these marquees when the government convened this Bletchley Park Safety Summit. And I think Oliver Dowd and Rishi Sunak, I think they meant well. But when you actually ask yourself, why have you assembled the whole world to talk about an existential risk that is either remote or certainly perhaps unlikely and certainly not imminent? Well, it's because every single newspaper had screaming headlines of robots with flaming red eyes saying they're going to eliminate humanity by next Tuesday. So I guess it's maybe rather old-fashioned, it's certainly unfashionable, I accept that. But to say, look, come on, we just got to be more disciplined and look at the evidence and not just because it's so emotive.
Sure. Let's talk about the evidence. I mean, it's easy to throw studies around. I did look at some quite interesting studies. I think it was actually TikTok and X, recent studies, and it was very simple. They would assign people up to the platforms, and then regardless almost of which political affiliation they said they identified with, I think there was one study in Germany, they were all of them consistently bombarded with far-right German political content. That was on TikTok, I think. X, obviously under Musk, is a very different company to what it was before. I wonder if your views on this have changed now that we have Musk running X, who quite clearly, to me at least, is deliberately fomenting polarization.
Sorry, absolutely. I should be super clear.
Okay.
I'm not I don't actually use X. I don't use TikTok. I didn't work for those companies.
Sure.
I totally accept that when I start speaking sweepingly about social media, I'm actually talking about the social media I know a lot more about.
Yeah.
And I'd say, and so absolutely, I think, I mean, X, as far as I can make it, it's just become a total sort of cesspit.
Yeah.
The thing I would say is twofold. Firstly, I don't want to understate the significance of the TikTokification of all social media. And it's this is a very profound thing. When I went to Silicon Valley in autumn of 2018, one of the reasons I went was I was, again, rather unfashionably, because it was not exactly a it's a reputationally obvious thing to do, but I genuinely retain this view that the kind of platform function where these social media apps served in effect as a platform for human beings, and because it's an ad-based model for free, to express themselves without hindrance, to communicate with family and friends and so on and so forth. I thought that I loved this idea that was a technology, sure it has its flaws and so on, but it was an extraordinarily enabling technology. And as a sort of old-fashioned liberal, this idea that it empowers you to, on a scale which is, quite unprecedented. But it was about human content. It was about enabling humans to generate content, communicate with each other and so on. That is now like a dim and distant memory. Now I don't know what the latest. I think when I left the company, I think 50% or maybe more of content on Instagram. I may be misremembering the statistic. It was not. It had nothing to do with your friends or family. It was completely unconnected from your social life. It was just stuff that was sort of fired at you by a recommendation engine, content that was sort of plucked from the furthest recesses of the internet, and of course increasingly content that is also synthetic and is not. So I think oddly enough, the social media that I often have in my head is social, whereas increasingly TikTok, YouTube, Instagram in particular, they're all basically becoming pipelines for recommended short-form video entertainment content. That's quite different. That's the first thing. Having said that, in the old world, because I was so curious exactly in the point you made, I helped, it was endless it was a bit of a tricky thing to get through, but finally persuaded the lawyers and others to construct with, I think it was 11 universities across the United States, by far the largest and academically entirely rigorous study of the interaction of social media and voting behavior and political behavior during the 2020 US presidential election.
Okay.
And I actually don't think anything's been repeated on that scale since. And you had huge control groups. I mean, you had like 250 people who would volunteer to use Facebook through the 2020 presidential election with no algorithmic ranking at all. So just a chronological feed. Another 250,000 who wouldn't use Facebook at all.
Right.
Another 250,000 who had no capacity to reshare, so no virality. And I think the academics haven't yet published all the papers, but they've published the bulk of them in peer-reviewed papers and so on, magazines and publications. But I don't think it's, and I'm sure I'm simplifying it a little, but in effect it showed how little effect there appeared to be between your consumption of social media and some of your political attitudes. Doesn't mean none and all the rest of it. I just get, and again, that may have changed now because social media has changed so much, it's become less social. But I kind of think we, and of course, remember politics and ideology and news. I mean, I think it constitutes, or at least when I last looked, constituted like 3%.
It is low, isn't it? I think it's sub 5%.
It's low, but listen, a low number out of squillions is still,
If you set aside impact for a minute and just sort of put that to one side, what about intention? So when I was hiring people coming out of Apple and Twitter and Instagram back in the day, pre them being acquired by Meta, the people working on social were saying to me, it was known within those companies that divisive stuff that made people angry did make them engage more, spend more time, and that was kind of encouraged. Did you have to stamp any of that culture out when you were at Meta?
So it's complicated, as they say, because of course, why do you have blaring headlines which instill rage or guilt or fear or envy on every newspaper? Because it elicits a visceral reaction. It's hardly rocket science to assert that an emotional reaction is more engaging to us, sort of anthropologically and psychologically. So, stuff online, much like stuff in print, if it has an emotive impact, is going to engage you more. I think what has happened, certainly in the times I was in the company, I think the rules which drew a line between emotive content and sort of willfully harmful content, inciting. I think there were 21 categories of content that I sort of presided over. They were called the community standards, from IP, fraud to hate speech to incitement to violence and so on and so forth. I think that became increasingly well policed. And also, what I think I also discovered is if you overdo it, or maybe X is proving otherwise, but this idea that if you just give people bilge, nasty bilge, that it's a sensible for your business model is not correct. It really isn't. Because actually after a while people just go, oh, screw it, I just don't like this stuff. And secondly, and very importantly, because the people who pay your lunch don't like it. If you're an ad business, the commercial incentive is actually oddly enough to do the reverse of what's often alleged, which is, I think, one of the flaws of the whole Professor Zuboff surveillance capitalism paradigm is, no, if you're selling soap powder or cars or plastic ducks, you want your ad next to sort of plain vanilla Disney type content,
aspirational stuff.
So the commercial incentive is always slightly pointed in a different direction. Now that doesn't mean that human reflex that you refer to, which is that we just our eyeballs go to stuff that elicits. Yeah, of course that's the case in life. Now, it is at a level of velocity. It is amplified, like everything. It's accelerated. It's personalized to a far greater degree in the social media age. I don't think there's any tweak. There's no algorithmic tweak that can stop the human tendency to respond to emotive content. I think there's a lot that can and has been done. Some of it's been altered recently as the mood swing has changed dramatically in the US. But yeah, so I think a better balance was struck over time.
Okay. Let's talk about that mood swing. From the outside looking in, it seemed like with Sheryl Sandberg and yourself, Mark Zuckerberg had people who were sort of moderating influences there. Ultimately, it seemed from the outside to make technology a force for good, to try and confront head on a lot of the issues we've been talking about. Very noticeably, after you left, almost immediately after you left Meta, Zuckerberg seemed to take a completely different direction of, just let it rip. Not just him, but clearly across Silicon Valley, much more of a focus on free speech, throwing away all moderation. We had someone from Andreessen Horowitz who created their American dynamism practice, Catherine Boyle, and she said basically, people on the internet tell the truth. That's really, it's not they're kind of saying one thing online which they don't really mean, and it's really extreme, and offline they're sort of all placid. It's like, no, that kind of, those points of view are real. They've been suppressed, and now this is what people really think, and we should let it rip. What's your take, not just on Meta, but maybe we broaden it out on the industry about that flip to a very different model?
So I think it's pretty difficult to understand all of that without dwelling on the magnitude of what happened in basically 2020 in the US. And 2020 is like the crucible of a lot of the changes. You had this extraordinary coincidence of the pandemic lockdown, which was way more contested in the US than it was here. Here I get the impression, I was living over there at the time, I get the impression if you say to the Brits, hey, we're going to pay you to stay home and drink tepid tea and watch daytime television, everyone goes, fine.
It was fascinating. People really almost wanted to be told what to do.
Yeah. I mean, it is actually genuinely very, and also
must have concerned you as a liberal.
Well, it has actually, and I also think economically. I mean, if you look at the terrible problems we've now got here as a country, this is a slight departure, but I think it is interesting. I can see why the UK government at the time did this furlough scheme. Yeah, but actually, with hindsight, it was probably a big error, because what they did in the US is they basically threw money at people, whereas the furlough scheme threw money at jobs, and it fostered this totally false illusion that you could just pick up your job where you left it at the end of the pandemic. Whereas in the US, you've had a huge amount of actually quite creative and often socially upward labour mobility and dynamism as people have come out of, and they've said, well, it's a fresh start, we've got to press restart.
Lots of business creation.
Yeah. Whereas here, I just think, we're still limping sort of post-COVID. Anyway, but in the US, it was I cannot exaggerate to you how different it was there. Just wearing the mask immediately became a political and cultural thing, and the red states wouldn't do it. And you went to Florida and Texas, you didn't wear a mask, you were proud not to. And of course, this demonization of Fauci by the right. Yeah. And then you had the George Floyd moment and all the race tensions, and you had Trump saying he was going to send in the troops, and should the social media companies companies have allowed that or not allowed that. In that instance, we did.
Yeah.
And then there was the election, and was the election, how could it be held during the pandemic? People like Mark Zuckerberg, actually in this case, totally innocently, gave a whole bunch of his own money to help election administrators. The right immediately said, you're bending the rules to help the Democrats.
Right.
Then you had this thing about Hunter Biden and his laptop.
Mm-hmm.
What a weird story. He leaves this laptop in a computer repair shop, and it's got all this filth on it, and that can't be right. And then X banned it altogether, and that spawned a great conspiracy theory. Facebook, we didn't remove it, but it was sort of demoted. I cannot tell you how much all of that plus more has just scrambled the political brain and the sort of political class in the US, and certainly radicalized a number of people in Silicon Valley. And of course, that then umbilically led to the Elon Musk takeover of Twitter, driven by this rage against the kind of excessive wokerati of the West Coast, and a belief that there was a conspiracy theory, and that I've had to give evidence in sort of congressional committees. Absolutely, this assertion that big tech was somehow, playing fast and loose with the truth, all to benefit the left, and it really, and the upshot of it, and it's very important for non-Americans to understand this, whether you like it or not, is that close to half the country did think by the time of the last election that Silicon Valley was actively censoring their worldview. So much though I find the whole stampede of all the tech bros to Mar-a-Lago and the White House pretty unedifying, and personally I don't think it's my personal view, it's one of the reasons why I moved on. I don't actually think it's very smart business either, because what are they going to do when there's a Democrat president? They're going to turn around. Right. So now we agree with everything that you believe. I mean, you can't have this ridiculous whiplash every time there's a change of political mood in the country, or a political incumbent in the White House.
You don't think that's good? Can I just ask you about that? You don't think that's good business?
No, it's not good business, because you certainly not when you're that size and you're that established and you have societal level prevalence. It seems to me, of course you have to box and cox a bit. And by the way, certainly with content moderation, it's not an exact science. It's not a fixed line. What people think is the acceptable line between content moderation and free expression isn't fixed. It's not defined anywhere. So it does move. But the reason I don't think it's good business is I think in the end it's much better for businesses not to be so snarled up with politics that they're constantly chopping and changing depending on who's won the election. You've got to sort of plot your own course a bit. It just seems to me that's smart business in the long run. Yeah. But just to your point about the shift,
sure.
So I think one can criticize and mock and all the rest of it, this rather sort of unedifying spectacle, and we can certainly have a debate about whether they've overdone it and all the rest of it, and speculate about how they're going to play things in the future if the political mood changes again. But the one bit I wouldn't denigrate as a non-American is there just was a big societal shift, and when you have half the population of your host country, your domestic market, saying I don't feel I'm being represented by these, then you have to shift. I mean, you can't. I mean, oddly enough, people like me, sort of what you could loosely call, I don't know, centrist or progressive folk, we might like to, why don't you keep the rules as they are? But it's like, well, hang on a minute. If that's actively considered to be inimical to the interests of half the public, what right do you have to say that your rules should prevail over their sentiment? So it doesn't surprise me that they had to shift on the context. And of course, as you know, the US just has this often, I think, slightly sort of pompous view that their First Amendment view of free expression is absolutely unique in the world, and everybody else is a sort of Soviet censor. Notwithstanding that, there is this passionately held view about the First Amendment and its role in safeguarding free expression. The pendulum will swing again.
Do you want it to swing back again, or are you happy with where it is?
No. It will swing again. It swung so violently from one direction to the other. It will shift, and it will shift driven by events. I actually think what it'll mainly shift to, and what it will mainly driven by, it won't actually be the old debates around should that post be allowed or not allowed, which is the sort of environment I inhabited. Is that AI you are falling in love with, or your daughter's falling in love with, or is giving you that market recommendation, or is telling you should book that holiday? Is that? I think we're going to see a whole slew of controversies, ethical, moral, societal, legal misgivings around our highly personalized dependency on AI entities, where the entity is the company speaking directly to us. It's very important. It means there'll be no Section 2, or at least I don't think there should be any Section 230 protection, because the platforms previously, in that lovely sepia-tinted world I described earlier, where it was all about humans producing human content, the platforms could not unreasonably say, well, we can't be held responsible for what humans post on our platform. They won't be able to say that in future because,
it's their AI slot.
It's like,
and do you think they will try to get around that by saying?
I'm sure they'll try and get around it, but I think there's going to be an almighty backlash. I think we're seeing now the seeds are being sown for quite a pitchfork rebellion against for a whole bunch of reasons. Partly with the reasons I said earlier. I just think the level of intrusive power which will be represented by this highly personalized, and of course particularly for vulnerable adults and kids, real vulnerabilities in how people interact with these AI entities, but also, as I think everybody listening to this podcast will know, the fundamental physics of generative AI is itself so centralizing. If you were worried enough about too much power being aggregated in the hands of a small coterie of people on the West Coast and tech leaders in China, you ain't seen nothing yet, just because it's so bloody expensive to build this stuff in the first place, which is why you've only got, just these, half a dozen men running all of this. So
and the wealth that they're going to get is going to. I mean, when we speak to these guys, they say you're going to off the record. They say you have to tax us at 90% because the wealth accumulation that the social media guys have got will be nothing compared to this.
And I always say this to people, and I mean this honestly with genuine affection about a lot of these people. I admire a lot of them. They are amazing business builders. They're ferociously competitive. They're ingenious. Business people, but they're not philosopher kings.
Right.
They're not labor.
They think
market.
they are.
Well, some of them certainly do. I just always say to people, just don't listen to Tech Bro X about his predictions about what's going to happen in the labour market, because he doesn't know. Don't listen to X when he says, I think the solution to all of this is universal basic income, which is very convenient to say in Silicon Valley. I'll earn all the money, and I'll work hard. All the rest of you, why don't you write poetry and hang out in the vegetable patch? It's so condescending. It's just condescending drivel.
Yes.
And I just think you shouldn't listen to they're technologists, they're engineers, they're highly driven, competitive men locked in an absolute existential battle with each other. They're generating great things, but they're builders and engineers. And I just always would encourage politicians and regulators and the press and the public to treat them like that. Give them respect, an enormous amount of respect for a lot of what they build. But they're not. They cannot or must not be regarded as somehow guides for how society should be organised.
Yes, you really riled them up the other week, didn't you? Yes. And I think Andrew Ross Sorkin quoted you saying something about how, they should, basically they shouldn't feel so sorry for themselves.
Did he?
Yeah, I think something about that.
Was he riled up?
No, well, he was. He quoted it, and then a whole bunch of them were very riled up and said, we,
I'm sure they had choice words for me. No, I think what I was saying, which I'm happy to repeat, which is one of the things, I loved my time in Silicon Valley. I made dear friends there. I was just there again the other day. It's been the most wonderful chapter of my life, really.
Yeah.
But like anything, like in Westminster and like when I spent 10 years in Brussels, there are negative aspects. And I think I just highlighted something that I always found so grating and still do, is like some of the richest people on the planet living in these gated communities in the sort of, spotlessly sunny part of California, whining that somehow they're victims of people being beastly to them. It's like the lack of self-knowledge. It's just pathetic.
Just get a grip, yeah. Let's close off part one by just talking a little bit about how to save the internet, which is your new book. And so we talked about, social media, and you've expressed, I think, a very balanced view there. But you are really worried now about the future of the internet. What are you so worried about?
Well, I thought what my motivation of writing the book was because there's lots to worry about, but there's one aspect which I just don't feel gets commented on enough, because it's a sort of classic, slow boiling frog problem. It's one of those things that incrementally getting worse, but there's no dramatic moment. Well, actually, I'll come to that. There were a couple of near misses recently, which would have, I think, brought all of this to people's attention. But it's just the fragmentation of the open internet. And as, again, I think many people listening to this podcast will know, the internet grew by accident, not by design. It was a sort of organic, layer upon layer, innovation upon innovation. There was no blueprint. There was no UN summit, thankfully, deciding there shall be an internet. It's slightly put, to use a Blue Peter phrase, or an old one, it's slightly, in the back end, it's slightly put together by kind of sticky back plastic.
Right.
So it's a much more fragile thing. And I think, but of course, it has at its heart something which people may disagree with, but I think is a wonderful thing. It has this, it demolishes geography. It doesn't recognize borders. It has this extraordinary emancipating openness about it, certainly outside China. And I think that is now colliding, if you like, the sort of globalizing power of these technologies, of the internet itself, turbocharged in the AI age, is colliding with the deglobalization of politics everywhere, whether it's Modi or Brexit or Trump or Erdogan or Putin. Politics everywhere, perhaps one is the reaction to the other, is all about building barriers. And so now everyone's regulating things differently. You've got this overarching geostrategic and geotechnological conflict between the US and China. You've got India almost as a swing vote in the middle. And I always think India is actually really the bellwether technology ecosystem to watch. If they go in a kind of China direction, then the kind of US, European, Atlanticist-led internet is going to be a thing of the past.
Not great then that Trump is trying to fight with them so much.
Not great. It's idiotic. I mean, it's beyond. It's beyond sort of mockery that the US should so willfully mishandle Modi. I mean, not that he's an angel, certainly not, but sort of drive him into the hands of Xi Jinping.
Sure. Absolutely.
And of course, India is big enough and has reserves of technological and engineering excellence. They could, if they wanted to, I hope they won't, but they could sort of try and do a version of the Chinese internet, hermetically sealing it off. And to my earlier point about near misses, about 3-4 years ago, I spent a lot of time in Delhi talking to ministers at the time, trying, not just me, of course, many others, as it turned out successfully, persuading them not to pass a law with a very technical name. It was called hard data localization, but really would, in my view, have been the first domino to fall in the profound fragmentation of and balkanization of the internet, because the law would have required that all data about Indians should be physically kept in India, and the US and the EU came very, very close to not being able to maintain the legal basis upon which data is conveyed every millisecond of the day across the Atlantic. That was just 2 or 3 years ago. So we've had some near misses where the kind of seamless data flows, which are the arteries of the internet, which we don't ever think about, we take for granted, could have been interrupted. So in a nutshell, I think it is just more and more likely that fundamental conflict of geography demolishing technology and geography reasserting politics will play out. And it's my view and assertion that over time, to avoid the internet just becoming fragmented, much more friction in everything we do online, much more difficult to seamlessly communicate and convey information from one side of the globe to the other. If we want to retain that openness, it requires an active act of leadership by what I call the 3 main techno-democracies of the US, India, and Europe, in that sort of order of descending importance. And so that's the sort of last third of my book, is sort of sketching out what that might look like.
Great place to leave it for part 1. Nick, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.